yes, the community mattered, and yes, the fellowship mattered, and yes, the positive role models and the resources and the soup kitchen, all these things help them build their life and, avoid recidivism. But when they tell you their story, they're going to use it through the lens of Christophany.
Hello, welcome. I'm Ben Boyce. This is the Dr. Junkie Show. And as promised, today I have part 2 of a conversation with Seed Dreams, where we venture into the realm of religion, theology, and belief. This was actually the early portion of a conversation that I shared with y'all last week, but I decided to release this piece of our talk as a standalone episode because it's pretty long, almost 40 minutes, and because it's an entirely separate issue from what we were talking about last episode. I think C and I will probably get back together to talk about these topics again in the future, and we'll make sure our audio turns out much better. Apologies again for the squelch that I failed to notice during the recording. I do want to offer a few brief thoughts to orient listeners before you dive in. At one point, I failed to specify that I was talking about the Old Testament story of Sodom and Gomorrah when I used the example of God dropping a nuclear bomb on LGBTQIA people. And I didn't notice until listening back through that C didn't seem to quite catch what I was talking about either. Instead of that story, I think she assumed I was talking about God in general. That got us off track briefly for obvious reasons. I also want to remind everyone that these issues are personal to both of us. But this was a good faith conversation between two friends. We dove into the tough stuff, and sometimes that meant pressing back against one another's taken for granted beliefs. But like I said last week, that's what good friends should do. Before I drop you into our conversation, I'm an agnostic. That just means I'm deliberately honest about what I believe and what I would like to believe, but cannot in good faith claim to actually believe, things that I've not yet been convinced of. I don't draw distinctions between religious or spiritual beliefs, like there's something bigger than me who looks out for my well-being, and daily logistical life beliefs, like when an ad promises something that's too good to be true, or like when a friend starts pitching me the latest multi-level marketing get-rich-quick scheme. I try to use the same criteria for evaluating all claims to fact, but some require more proof than others, or, as Carl Sagan used to say, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I attempt to hold that line regardless of what realm a specific claim falls into. The technical way for this way of thinking is the scientific method, and the benefit of it, or what many see as a negative, is that it always forces you to reevaluate and reevaluate again any claim of fact whenever new evidence shows up, no matter how taken for granted that fact is. The good news is that means if I'm wrong about something that I hold dear today, and I most certainly am wrong about many things, I have a chance to one day update those incorrect beliefs and get a little bit closer to capital T truth. Now, none of this means that God isn't real or that your version of God isn't the correct version, although we all know the Mormons are the one people who got it right. That's a joke. It just means that I don't claim to believe things that I'm not convinced are true. Of course, this also means I have to be willing to admit when I've been wrong about something, like often happens in my life. Belief, or lack thereof, isn't evidence of truth or fact. It's just evidence that you're a human. As an agnostic, I simply go out of my way to make sure that I treat all claims of fact with the same scale, because I know that as a human, I'm designed to make mistakes in judgment, and then to deceive myself and make those mistakes worse. I think our conversation speaks for itself on most everything else we discuss. Again, thanks to C for being willing to wade into these often dangerous and uncharted waters of religion and theology. With that, I hope you enjoy C Dreams.
I started kind of getting known as a criminal justice advocate and a journalist that focuses on policing and drug policy. I was like, there is an intersection here. I'm reading all of these studies and stuff like that. And so that made me shift into the field of what I call theological criminology, kind of the intersection of crime, sociology, and theology, looking specifically at the impact that spiritual beliefs and religious creeds have relevant to the lives of people that have prison sentences and felony convictions, but also to prison adjustment, to how people are able to cope in those environments, and recidivism rates, the impact that faith-based communities have had on numerous studies have been done in like Chicago and Baltimore and Atlanta. That's my niche now. And
now people realize why I had so many comments on the, on the document, because you actually, I like the way you worded it in this discussion. Before, I kind of got the impression at parts that what you were arguing was a certain brand of Christianity or a certain religious strain was the solution. And as soon as you add that extra piece, which is fellowship, social connections, we're right back to what you and I really agree on, which is identity. When you figure out a way to make somebody's identity update, to change something about who they are, and they get new tools in the tool bag that they can pull out, that's the solution to getting somebody to want to stop doing things they've done in the past if they're problematic. But often in our culture, that is still 63% of people in the United States, which is way down from what it was, would qualify themselves as Christians. When you say a religious fellowship, you usually mean a Christian fellowship of some sort. A 12-step treatment, you usually mean a Christian-based treatment of sorts. So that's probably a big part of, which I'm sure you'll get to in your work, why those things work so well is it's really easy to find them. Us agnostics that go out looking for our local community meeting, like we're going to be looking for a while.
Well, I think as an addendum, I want to say that I think that all religious faith-based communities have value and that they are valid and that they can create the same type of circumstances, conditions, and phenomena that garner change and help to sustain that change. But I will say that my favorite, I'm sorry?
Can we say most, not all? Not like the Nike wearers or the Al Qaedas.
No, I wouldn't go that far, because I use faith when I'm talking about in terms of faith or religion, I mean sincere held convictions. And so I also mean those that fall inside of a certain moral spectrum too. And that's kind of, that area right there is up for debate. And I don't want to go into that part. But what I mean to say is, do I believe that people that have an authentic pagan religious based, like an earth-based spirituality, do I believe the same things can occur amongst them statistically? Sure, absolutely. There's not much data for it. There hasn't been many studies done for it. But do I believe that the potentiality is there? Of course. My paper primarily was written through the lens of Christianity because I went through to a Christian seminary and I'm a Christian. And it's very important when we talk about the role of spiritual influences in relation to crime, punishment, and rehabilitation. Okay? Because, religion has played a significant role in the development of the carceral system, and in some ways, the humanizing of the carceral system. For me particularly, it's very important that we take people's perspective. We can't just analyze the facts alone by itself. The data is great, but we have to listen to how people express their experience. And so when people are saying, yes, the community mattered, and yes, the fellowship mattered, and yes, the positive role models and the resources and the soup kitchen, all these things help them build their life and, avoid recidivism. But when they tell you their story, they're going to use it through the lens of Christophany,
right.
Christ.
Why?
Exactly.
Why? I mean, in this culture, all the things you just listed, if somebody came along and said, oh, you've been successful to some degree at recovery and you stayed out of prison, what helped you? And they say the soup kitchen, how many gold stars do they get? Most people would be like, oh, well, what else? If they say God in the United States, they get hugs. People give them like, what, good for you, brother. They've learned every time they say that, they get this incredible rush of dopamine. They feel like they've accomplished something. They said the right thing. They reached in the tool bag and pulled out, I don't know why I was successful is the real answer. We're all incredibly lucky given the way the system is built if we manage to avoid recidivism. So if there is this association there, I wonder if the way they describe that association might be a result of like how they've learned to describe it, because it is all of those things. And if the soup kitchen was secular, it still was really valuable.
And I agree with you. I think that the soup kitchen or whatever resources that were available, should be given their gold stars. They should receive their kudos. However, I think that when we're talking about people's motivation or the things that got them through a particular ordeal, we may have a hard time conceptualizing it in a paradigm that is relevant or conceivable, understandable for us. But all that matters is that their perspective, the paradigm that they live in, they exist in. There are people who are disingenuous, that they, as you said, are pulling it out almost like a trope.
No, I think they're genuine. I think that we all are humans and sticky. And first we have, I should send you free will, and we should do a whole podcast about that. Sam Harris sent all of my students free books, and he writes about free will, and we'd have a great talk about it, because my guess is you largely believe there's something like free choice that we all make along the way. And I think that from the bottom up, we're all programmed up based on, what happened earlier, but we are also programmed up to always have a good fucking answer for any question. When somebody says, why'd you do that? In our left brain hemisphere, we'll spit out an answer. And if somebody says, no, you're wrong about that one, and they convince us we're wrong, we don't go, oh shit, I might have been wrong.
I mean, there is a degree of truth to that. I feel like the issue though here is there's always going to be a different way of kind of doing the accounting in this type of situation, depending whether or not your worldview is theistically inclined or atheistically inclined. Okay.
Right.
And I
or
think
in the middle, like me, neither.
and I always tell people, and this shocks a lot of people, I am a believer, but I'm also a biblical minimalist. I believe.
Well, you have to be. This is where this conversation could swerve off the rails, because if we start digging into scripture, you're going to run into this your whole life. I mean, really, people that you think are your family that are going to be like, you are a proud sinner, and that is not acceptable in these spaces, and it will rift churches who are going to the scriptures. The bedrock here was, what do people mean when they say this thing that's very close to nonsense unless they explain it? It was God that helped me. Because we all, exactly like you said, most people mean something kind of different. Some of us mean in my worst day, I begged for help and then I felt better. Others of us mean I was broke and my house was going to get took and a rent check showed up. Others of us mean the universe, like the way the steps of the righteous are ordered of the Lord, is I think that's in Proverbs.
All of those to me are just different types of theophanies. They're different types of ways that we could explain saying the interaction, or if you want to go so far, the intervention of God, So people find different ways, believers find different ways that they need to conceptualize and interact with the idea of divinity. And I think the idea that God is very static, or divinity is very static, the universe is very static, and that it's not malleable and it doesn't interact with and take on individualized forms for people, I think that is a very pernicious idea. I think that that's the reason why I have such a huge problem with
dogmatism. Can you talk about that more? What do you mean the universe is?
Well, any of those kind of colloquialisms that we use, the universe, the powers that be, the first cause, the first principle, God, whatever term that we use to point to the fully unknowable first.
In other words, assuming everybody means what you and I mean by God.
Well, that's what I'm putting out here. What I'm putting out is people have different concepts of it. But just because their concept is different doesn't mean that their concept is any less accurate. Because if this first thing is all of these things, then all we're doing is we're interacting with this thing, this deity, this being, this concept from different facets. And I think that the idea that people have when they get highly dogmatic, that there's only one face or one manifestation or one correct concept surrounding this idea of God, then that's dangerous. That's wrong. And I think that we have to create space for people to perceive of the divine and interact with it how they can. I have my personal recipe of what works best for me. And I agree
here, actually.
Yeah.
But the problem is what's next. Here's where it gets shitty, because we only got two ways to go from that premise. One is into the world of what we can evaluate with our senses and find God in nature and realize those leaves, they turn different colors every year, but the trees don't die. And why is that? That is incredible. And if you've insisted there's this ultimate creator, discovering how that stuff works is beautiful. It's evidence-based. Here's the problem. Most people at that same juncture where we just agreed God means something different to everybody, they rightly so, go looking for what God means. And where do they go? Holy books that you're saying you minimize. So if we're going to stick with the thing that's like, well, we kind of got to pull them back to the stay with just the God is whatever you want him to be. Say that again.
I'm sorry to interject. I want to be clear, though. I don't minimalize. My position as a biblical minimalist refers to the way that I approach scholarship around any type of religious text, not just the Bible in general, but in any type of text. And what it means is I'm looking for the historicity, and I'm looking for the anthropology, and I'm looking for those things, because I understand that there are semiotics, there's symbolism,
it's bigger than the books.
There's analogies in these books that have unfortunately been taken as literal factual truth when they're not. They are much deeper. They're esoteric in nature.
Some. I mean, it's really hard to read as poetic a list of laws that were given directly from God and then practiced by Israelites for thought.
I didn't say that was. That's
actually. Oh, right. Some is what I said. So yeah, I agree with you. Many of them have to be, and not. I'll go one step further. We probably agree here too. Religions, like cultures, are living. Like if they stop adapting. So those same scriptures that said, if your bride doesn't bleed enough on her wedding night, you can drag her back to her dad's house, demand your dowry back, and if you won't give it to you, stone her to death in front of her family. That meant one thing back then, and then 2,000 years ago it meant something different, probably a shout out to how things used to be and we've improved. And now we read it, and this is a spot where you and I would probably agree, like, don't follow that one. If you're looking for that from that first point of, I believe in God and it's unique to me and it's beautiful and I know it's true, the next step has got to be go find out who he is, or it's the biggest thing in the universe, right? Your entire eternity is going to be with this thing, this entity. Do yourself a favor and go the next step to figure out who it is. We immediately are forced to go into these books that you and I agree we've got to now go another step and get professionals on board. I need a pastor to tell me what the hell this verse means, and we're back to Nike land.
I would like to point out here that I think that the great Christian mystics of the 15th and 16th century, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, the Chrysostom, these people, they had ecstatic, personal, eminent relationships with the divine. And I think that theirs is, even though, there was a degree of scriptural adherence in their lives, they let the nature of God and what he, or she for some people, meant to them manifest through that relationship.
That's terrifying.
I think that today we live in such a fundamentally oriented world in terms of specifically Christianity, but we see fundamentalism obviously in all religion. But I feel like the Protestant motto of the 17th century, 16th century, sola scriptura, only the Bible, only what it says and only as it says it right here. It's become such a dangerous thing because it won't even allow people to evolve in their relationship with God and how they interact with him. And what's so crazy is the very scriptures that are used to try to make people's spiritual identity stay the same, be static. Those same scriptures actually encourage an evolution of spiritual welfare. So I think it's, well, no, because it's
Jesus Christ the same yesterday, today, and forever. Or as Jesus said, if one letter, one iota of the law changes, it will be after I've already finished all of my work. Not one letter. So there's
the word that he uses for one nature. By the way, the word that he uses for one nature, it's a word that has
two words in that scripture: iota and one letter.
It has a pleroma of fullness and meaning, and what that actually kind of entails is that.
Right. But I'll come all your way. Because this is where it's called apologism. And this is the problem.
Yeah,
where does hopefully the person that says, but I really want to learn more about God, comes to you before they pick up their Bible, because we both are dodging the question. The answer to that question is, how do I learn more about this feeling I know is real? Go to the Holy Book. And the second you crack that thing, you are going to be like, what the fuck is going on? Is this what love is? Luckily, we've got many people like you in the world that study it and take a perspective that says you've got to read it as historical document, as poetry, as snapshots of what humanity has gone through and consistently tried to improve itself. But we also know that if you back off and do what you were saying, which is maybe don't go the scriptural route so much as search out that feeling in your heart. We just included people that fly planes into the World Trade Center. I sincerely think they were sincere in their belief. I think they truly thought they were about to go to paradise.
I agree. I think that my advice to somebody that came to me, and I would like to be clear, even though I'm ordained, like I am a reverend, I don't work in the pastorate at all. I am
today you do.
I'm strictly scholarly oriented.
But today you're a pastor. This was a pastor relationship or a pastor conversation to somebody that's listening.
Well, I'm glad. I really, and I give glory for that, and I'm glad that I can help anybody I can. So this is what I would say. I would advise a companionable route. I would tell people to look at the text as showing them a glimpse into a period of development in a particular group's people in their particular time, an insight into their mind, into the way they perceived the proper function of community, the way they perceive the proper function of roles, of gender division, of consequences, all these things. And then I would tell them to shift their focus immediately to the New Testament and pay attention to Jesus's actions. And I would tell them to draw out.
Jesus invented hell. I mean,
first of all, I have not found anybody that's convinced me in a scriptural basis for hell. Okay.
Oh, I just know Jesus is the first one that talked about a lake of fire prepared for the devil and his angels. There was no mention of it in the Old Testament. Paul shows up and starts keeping women in their place.
Other destruction are being done away with, but it's not hell the way. For example, in the New Testament,
a lake of fire.
Yes, there's descriptive language in the scriptures that is meant to be powerfully evocative.
We're back to like, if you read it by yourself, you're fucked. But if they bump into you, you can explain to them these specific verses. You can change the words because we're not very good at translating. I agree again, by the way. It's been the Bible wasn't written in English, y'all. I know some people literally just went like, wait, what? It was written in Hebrew and in Greek, and then it was retranslated because language is also alive. So through the thousands of years when there weren't copy machines, this is something you should be explaining, not me, but scribes would by hand copy text. And when they ran into a word that used to mean, say, young woman, but now the meaning had shifted, or they thought Jesus was born of a virgin. This is one example of where I'll give you some credit. The Bible doesn't say he was born of a virgin. He said it was born of a young woman in Isaiah for the prophecy. They changed it to mean virgin. And then, of course, language changed more and those words solidified. Errors were made here and there. And then we start translating it over and over and over into English, which is where you and I were born.
Yeah. So my biblical specialty language actually wasn't Hebrew or Greek. It was Latin because the Vulgate was the first put together complete copy of the Bible. So that was what I chose as my biblical language, although I do have some modest proficiency in Hebrew and Greek. I tell people this all the time. I tell them that it's important to understand how the same way words in our language can oftentimes have numerous connotations or can take on, like, think of the word dog alone, okay? So the dog means obviously a literal canine, and then it can mean homeboy or friend, and then it can mean like a despicable down low person, like, oh, he's such a dog, So there are connotations and there's layers to the language, and a lot of times, especially in a culture that was hyper patriarchal and hyper sexist and was very, very old, antiquated, a part of the very last dregs of the ancient world, the translations that have gotten to us tend to probably be the least humane and the most extremist, and not always the most accurate.
So we should throw them away. Sorry. That would be my argument, is now that we feel like the God in my heart is not the person that bombs LGBTQ people into a crater without warning and commands 12-year-olds to take up arms with their dads.
That's not God. People have been so hurt by the Christian organization.
It was either him, he's either immune to stopping it, and he just was like, hey, I'm not going to tell everyone else to leave, but you good people get out of here. Or it was God.
You're saying God could take away all suffering and all disease. And
I would not say that. No, absolutely not. Either God is not all powerful or he's not all good. I mean, it's only one of the two options, because if he's all powerful and he's letting babies fly through windshields and silly accidents, that says something about his character that I'm not trying to, that's not something I'd ever tell someone to emulate. So to come your way, I'd have to be more inclined to believe that God is at the very least good, but has to be hands off because people go through horrific things that scar them for life.
So I'm going to say that I'm not comfortable taking that position. It doesn't line up with my personal sentiment. And I also have to be, if I ever want to have a job in academia, like especially like Christian academia, I'm gonna have to be, that's not something that I can flat out say, because number one, I don't fully agree with it. But number two is it tends to be problematic, as it tends to conflate ideas that are Marcionic and Gnostic rather than Orthodox.
The omniscient part?
Well, the concept that either God is not fully good or that he's not all powerful is an inherently Gnostic thought. It streams back to the idea of God being the demiurge, a figure who was a lesser divinity, also known as Samael or Salak, meaning the fool or the blind one. And they called him that because he didn't realize that he was only one of numerous divinities, and a lesser one made in a pale imitation of the true divinities called the pleroma, the fullness.
Right.
And that concept states that God is not all powerful. And that then there's another concept that finds its roots in Zoroastrianism, which is a pre-Israelitic, pre-Christian religion from the Persian region, where there is a constant conflict between the God of good and the God of evil, the two gods being called Ahura Mazda and Ahriman.
Dialectics, to borrow your phrase earlier. But people aren't going to find you for this either. When we're born into this world, we look around and we see how things work. We have this feeling in our heart, or more accurately our mind, but we call it like our heart, these feelings and emotions associated with love and compassion and empathy for our fellow human beings. And then we start looking for it, and we don't run into all the stuff you're saying. We see babies flying through windshields and accidents that were so easy to avoid if something could have just raised the curb half an inch. Or the sort of go-to example is with the cars 10 years ago now that we thought had accelerators stuck, and people were driving 120 miles an hour into walls because they couldn't get their cars to stop. We found out later, here's the real irony, it was actually most likely that the rug had moved over the accelerator and the driver didn't notice. But there's 911 calls of cars full of people on a way to a Christian conference praying to God to just help them stop their car until they run into a wall. All I'm saying is, from our perspective, where we were born into this world, we have to come to one conclusion. Either there is a person that can intervene in any way, shape, or form on the planet and chooses not to in those situations, or it's just a hands-off entity.
So I want to circle to something really quickly. A few months ago, I was a part of a debate, and it was something that I enjoyed, but it was something I regretted because I had a whole, I was debating a well-known atheist on Twitter. Him and I were friends at one point, and then we fell out, actually. But he's a well-known atheist on Twitter, and he and I did this discussion thing, and I want to say this back in October. And his following was kind of decent or whatever, but I just feel like it's harder to get people on Twitter to come out for my side than it is for the atheist side, right? So I was in this discussion. I'm not going to guess to that, but I was in this.
I can guess to that.
Yeah, I was in this discussion where it was like, well, I think some of the very things that Christians are often accused of, the vehemence, I guess, it's on the other side too. I also think
it's just as bad on the other side.
I also think that a lot of people don't like to have their, one of the guys that I answered questions from, he's like, you seem so intelligent. So for you to believe in this stuff, he said, it blows my mind. You must be delusional. And of course, it's hard to have a meaningful conversation with somebody who will ridicule your intelligence by offshooting it as you're mentally unstable.
Tell me about it.
If you're going to call me mentally unstable, I'd rather let's be about I have gender dysphoria. I'm a transsexual woman. So let's talk about that in terms of mental instability, but since it's actually a real
talk about intersectionality in that conversation. Holy shit. And hopefully I'm not coming across that way. I grew up, I'm sure you know this, and I'm sure most listeners do, but I grew up in an evangelical Christian household. And not just a stand aside, don't get involved, but I was in junior Bible quiz. My time in prison was spent largely doing a lot of what you're doing, but without the education. So nowhere near as well as you, learning and finding people around me who were also deep into the Bible and spending 5-6 hours a day reading it and getting my Strong's Concordance out so I could figure out what the hell these words meant. It wasn't until I got out and realized that a lot of my things that sent me to prison were directly related to my spirituality and my religion and my ability to do what I keep toying with at the point that most people go to from after they realize there is a God and they start to look. It is training people to shortchange themselves and come to conclusions and then not double check those conclusions. It's fine with just your spiritual beliefs, but what about when I'm praying for things and I manage to drag addiction into my spiritual identity, and then I put it on God because there's nothing I could do. And that is a part of what spirituality is supposed to be.
People have we have a habit of authoring events in our lives. And then when it doesn't work out the way we think that it should, or when it benefits us, we will justify it and excuse it, or we'll assign the blame, allocate the blame to God. But the reality is that God is a God of sensical things, okay?
Yeah, that's not what I'm doing here, by the way. If I'm coming across wrong, I'm not blaming it on God. I'm blaming it on my belief system, which was built around what I'd say 80% of Christians in the United States would agree with most of, which is just Jesus is the Son of God. Can you prove it? Don't need to. Then put it in that space that says immune from evidence, not going to consider it. It's infallible. It's right.
Yeah.
And then, was he born a virgin? Yes. Does he heal people? Sometimes. Absolutely. Is there an eternity that if I believe the things I'm saying, I'll get to go to heaven? Yes. And I put all these things in. If some asshole would have come along and said, I got evidence that shows you're wrong, I would have kicked him to the curb. It wasn't about evidence. That tent of spirituality, of faith, of different reasoning, not saying, let me double check because I'm a human. I'm wrong about every fucking thing in my life, right? Even when I think I'm right, and I've said it for 10 years, I sometimes am like, I was wrong about that. I got to keep double checking, just not these things. Like most people, a few dead carcasses get dragged into that tent because as humans, I've never met one who's good enough to, exactly what you're saying. We explain things in real time certain ways. So I'm not blaming God, and I'm not blaming belief. I'm blaming this exception that I built into my reasoning that says sometimes evidence doesn't matter.
Ben, I'm sorry. I feel like that is a gross mischaracterization of what happens. The relationship is never out. I don't know about what happens inside of that tent of spirituality, as you termed it. Yeah. I feel like this idea of good enough is incredibly pernicious. I feel like it's inaccurate and it's not part of the relationship.
What do you mean, good enough?
So there is a divergence. There is a crossover from the Jesus of history and the Christ of faith. They are the same person, but they have different prerequisites for how you interact with them.
Sure.
The Jesus of history is very easy for a rational-minded person. And for me...
Not for me. I'm rational-minded.
The Jesus of history, not the
Christ.
He's
not. I mean, I would bet if I was I am a gambler, but if you could bet on such a thing, more than 50% he existed. But no, reason and evidence says there's actually a chance that he never existed.
Actually, that's not true. No.
There's zero chance?
There's no branch of scholarship that is convinced that the historical man, Yahshua ben
Not convinced. I'm saying there's a chance. There's a chance that the person didn't exist just because we didn't live in a world like we have now. It was documents. He never existed till 33 years after he died. So the first document ever written about this dude that survived was written about 30 years. Is that still on point with what you understand?
That's right. But that's also
there's just a chance that
right. That's also not incorrect for the contemporary tone, though. That's not uncommon.
I bet on it. If you heard me wrong, I'd say I bet he did exist.
There is a slew, though. There is so much evidence in favor of the existence of the historical man.
Can you run through a little bit real quick?
I'm not talking about the messianic figure.
Yeah, can you run through like a quick list? I don't think there is, but this would be a cool place to change my mind. I didn't know there was.
There's numerous writings that are found from Roman officials. There are writings that are from
when he was alive.
From the Johann. Yes.
That's surprising to me because my research all showed that he didn't exist until 30 years later.
I'm sorry, I misunderstood you. What'd you say?
I was under the impression he didn't exist in writing until 30 years later.
Oh, yeah, that's about right. That is about correct, yes. What I'm saying
Why would Roman officials write about him then?
What I'm talking about is there are recounts from Justin Martyr, from Tertullian, of course, the original Gospelic writings. The first writing happened in 48, 58. So there are documentations, but for that time period in the antiquitous world, it wasn't at all uncommon for writers to begin to put into, if ever, because oftentimes oral traditions were created first, and those oral traditions spring into writings. I think that the first person that really understood the importance of beginning a written, both a legacy and a liturgy around the Christian movement was Paul, okay? He really understood the importance of it, and from his example, it continued. But there is more evidence to suggest the reality of the historical figure. No scholar that has any relevant standing is convinced that he is not.
But that's what I said. If I was going to gamble on it or you could do such a thing, my money would be on the fact that he did. actually exist. I've read accounts that say it wouldn't matter if he didn't. He'd still be just as beautiful in my mind if he didn't. But I know that to a lot of people, that'd be, again, because the Bible, it'd be a deal breaker for some reason. But the image of Christ, if whether or not somebody existed 2,000 years ago, why would that bother people?
Yeah,
it sounds like it would.
I was trying to finish an idea I was trying to convey. I was trying to say that most people have a difficult time making the transition from a historical figure to a figure of faith. And I find that that is the area that a lot of the misunderstandings occur in. And I feel like it's an area that's very human and very natural because we want to be able to understand something in a context that feels rational and believable and fact-driven to us. That's in our nature. But the reality of faith, and this is where I tell people that faith and reason can exist, they can coexist, and they can do it quite matrimoniously and harmoniously. But the reality is that when we talking about faith, we are talking about, as the Bible says, the substance of things hoped for but not seen, okay? There is a degree of, I've heard some people call it the suspension of disbelief, okay?
Well, infallibility, like I said, like it's not up for debate. You couldn't have it disproven because it's not about proof or evidence, which is fine. That's faith.
That's totally fine.
Yeah, I agree.
The reality is that there are certain things in our life that we have to make a pivotal adjustment for. We have to decide to believe. A lot of people do it all the time with political, and we can of course say, well, a political candidate is a real person, we can touch them, etc. But we often have to make the transition from the knowledge, the kind of circumstantial evidence we have about them, into believing that everything they say they're going to do, or believing that they really feel this way, or believing that they represent our best interests, etc. And while this is a little bit like oranges and apples because political candidates are flesh and blood, I think the big thing is when we're talking about faith-based figures, it is important to look and see, are there historical indicators that allow us to make that transition? For me personally, I would have never been able to be a believer if I didn't have historical things that pointed to true historical events that gave me foundational groundwork to say, okay, from here, I'm willing to believe. I'm not willing to believe blindly, but if you give me a little bit of stuff that is historically based, then I have something that the reach doesn't feel quite as dramatic. It doesn't feel quite like overreaching quite as much. So we just have different minds. To contribute on that topic, though.
Yeah, well, and I don't want to eat all your time up talking about. I always appreciate when I meet somebody that this is their specialty, because as you can tell, it's just kind of the theme of our talks, right? When you move to a new stage of your life, you don't just like leave all the old you behind. You're still you, right? You've just added like another layer. And for you, it's been like years now of these theology, this education that's beautiful. It's like we're rapping at each other and we're not even pre-rehearsed. And for me, it's stuff that I still crack the Bible for various reasons to, just make sure I remember something, right? But that stuff didn't go away the second I allowed myself to ask myself the question, are you sure you believe? Because you would be doing Jesus a bit of a disservice if you were just saying it. And I realized I just believed in belief. I really believed I was supposed to believe. But that doesn't mean other people are lying when they say they believe. It's incredible. We're on the same page with like 95% of stuff, but there's a few things that are almost always me saying, yeah, but shouldn't we keep questioning that? It doesn't always lead people the wrong way. It just, for me, it had a lot to do. My thinking patterns to be able to disclude some things from evidence got just me. Maybe no one else ever in the history of the planet, but got just me in trouble. The second I dropped all the religious stuff, maybe the devil blesses people and that would somehow be he's got superpowers too. But my life, it's not perfect, and nobody's is, but I feel like that was the first time I found direction and started to evaluate things. So I guess everybody has their own way here. Hopefully.
And I think that is a very interesting side of that because, I usually hear that story the other way around. I usually hear it as the moment that I began seeking a relationship and studying and praying and trying to make better decisions, trying to be a better person, not just the internal realm of
which
belief.
Gets you more kudos to say in our culture.
But it shouldn't be just about kudos because the thing about it is
you can't help it. You're human.
I would get way more kudos if I was.
I mean identity. The kudos is part of it. But what I'm saying is which of these two statements gets you more people that are like, that don't make no fucking sense. We're humans. Like, even though we try to be critical all the time, like in most things, we try to always be like, am I misreading someone? Or was somebody being mean to me, but they actually didn't get breakfast this morning? Or we generally try to be better people. There's these some things that we just sort of leave out of that. And that, again, it's like, it probably isn't this way for everybody, but my life didn't clear up and get on track until I realized I've been exerting massive amounts of energy because I was stuck on commands, kind of like what you said. I had realized the only place to learn more is the Bible, because that's my religion. I was bounced on my mom's knee on, so it stuck with me the most, right? And the more I read it, the more I was like, I got a lot of work cut out for me. It was all apologist work. It was figuring out, I know any Joe Schmo that read this would think God was a monster and they should be a monster too. I've got to get to work fixing these mistakes without fixing these mistakes. And maybe I should have stumbled into a theology degree, because then I probably would have had that opportunity in front of me. And that's what we're talking about, identity, right? The more that shows up, the paths, if you're a religious person, that open in front of you, the paths of the righteous are directed to the Lord is another proverb. No matter how you look at it, there is some truth to the idea that whatever shows up in your life, you look back 10 years later and you're like, wow, who would have thought I'd be this far? So kudos to you again, by the way, because it's been impressive to be a follower of your work, even these last, whatever it's been now, a year. You've been busting them out. How long do you have? I don't want to keep you too long. Do you got time to keep talking? No, we can get into some of the...
As much time as you need.
That was C Dreams. I did send C a copy of Sam Harris's book, Free Will, and hopefully she has enough to say about it that we'll talk about that again sometime in the future. So stay tuned for that conversation. You can check out the episode description for lots of links to more information about today's topics, or for links to C's work on both Filter and other sources. Thanks to C for the chat. Thanks to y'all for listening, and love yourselves and the addicted people in your life. I'm Ben Boyce. If you're still here, you might want more. So consider checking out my book, Dr. Junkie, One Man's Story of Addiction and Crime that will challenge everything you know about the war on drugs. You can get it wherever you buy books. If you want to know what the world would look like if drugs were legal, or why we develop tolerance and sensitization to drugs when we take them for extended periods, or if you just want to know why I went to prison, check out the book.